to the point at the present day and age, the real problem is not just those simple reports, right? That's par for the course. How do we use the data at hand to generate, more next level type stuff, analytics, trend pattern recognition, predictive analytics, scenario modeling, but not scenario modeling, 10, 15 years ago, which was more at a higher level, like more detailed data-driven scenario modeling, right? At the customer level, at the product SKU level, stuff like that. That's where CFOs struggle nowadays when it comes to data. So it's a paradigm of how it used to be and how it is today. And really, when you look at the resources that really thrive and the assets that really thrive in today's day and age, it's storytelling, right? So how can you take this data? How can you actually tell the story, right, of what's actually happening? Because that's the CFO is concerned about, right?
Welcome to the Data Heads podcast. We're super excited to have Chris Scholz on here with us. He has over a decade of experience in finance and data consulting from Deloitte to other major consulting firms in providing companies with that bridged gap between the data teams and the finance teams. And he's helping us learn how to communicate more effectively and properly with our CFOs, with our finance partners, and that gap that is severely missing within most of our organizations. So thank you, Chris, for joining. We're very excited to have you on.
Super happy to be here. Super happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so I think one of the biggest things that I think we're all kind of curious about from your perspective is, where do you feel like the biggest miss is for those in senior data roles and the relationship with the CFO?
That's a good point to start on here. I think, a key gap from the data perspective, interfacing with the office of the CFO. And the office of the CFO, I really consider that to be inclusive of finance, accounting, FP&A type roles, really anything that goes under that umbrella. But is in kind of understanding, where the CFO folks are coming from and where their concerns are. I know that when you look at from like a data team perspective, a more tech oriented perspective, they probably look at the finance folks as always, like you said, kind of being on their backs and maybe give them a hard time. And it can almost sometimes develop into a bit of an adversarial type relationship, but it doesn't need to be. And I think a little bit of understanding of kind of where that CFO perspective is coming from, kind of what they're trying to get out of that kind of data function would go a long ways.
So what is it you feel like the data teams really miss that kind of whether it be kind of a historical understanding of accounting and finance as it relates to data, or
sure,
wherever that may is, but where do you feel that the data people really are not understanding finance and their needs?
Yeah. And so when you think about it, I think a lot of technical folks that I work with that get into some of the stuff that either I'm doing or my colleagues are doing or projects that I'm involved in, that oftentimes they're oftentimes blown away at the level of data and level kind of technical stuff that we're working on from the finance perspective. And I think understanding and kind of knowing some of that context would go a long way in understanding that data drives finance, and finance really kind of is a data native function, data native organization. You look at the role of finance and accounting in general, really is to kind of take transactional activity and turn it into data and then action off it, right? And even going back historically, I don't think it's that far-fetched to say that finance is probably one of the largest, if not the largest, consumer of data in an organization. And I think a lot of tech folks are kind of surprised about that when they kind of get into the space sometimes and see, I think there's this misconception of just, finance and accounting teams being just these, accountants sitting in the back room, making journal entries and filling out spreadsheets. But we're really dealing with large amounts of data and trying to, wrangle that data in a way to drive business decision making. It could be, where do we invest? How do we price this? Do we hire? Do we not hire? Decisions that actually very much impact the data team and other teams of the organization, but trying to do that in a data-driven way. If you think about, I think understanding, you mentioned there, like the history of kind of finance data, right? I think understanding that from a data team or tech team perspective is helpful. You look at maybe 20, 30 years ago, I kind of consider it like three main buckets. And 20, 30 years ago, kind of more in the past. I'm not going to go further back than that because that's, prior to, more information age type stuff and PC type stuff. But 23 years ago, just being able to kind of source data and store data, like that was the significant win, right? Like being able to do that in and of itself was big. Back then, like data platforms and tools and GL systems and ERP systems, were complicated, expensive, hard for users to interact with, right? And just being able to produce kind of simple reports, whether it be simple financial reports, income statement, balance sheet, a simple sales report. So how much revenue does customer A, B, C generate? Just being able to produce those, like that was a big win, right? Um,
Right. So you're just saying that the
fast,
technical intricacies made it overwhelmingly difficult, and so then the data team was a hero because they solved like Pandora's box and were able to get them a report that showed them um, what was their balances and their P&Ls and all those types of
exactly
things,
right.
and what was the individual transactions that rolled it up, right?
Exactly right. And when you were, in the space, let's say 20 years ago, all anyone, I'm talking about the CFO org space, talking about data, really all anyone ever talked about was, how do we store, how do we aggregate, how do we consolidate this data, data marts, data warehouses, those sorts of things. Um, and like you said, the data folks played such a huge role in making that a reality and being able to do those sorts of things and saying, oh man, now I can generate that P&L in a few minutes and grab some of that information in a few minutes versus something would take my team, a week to pull together before. Those were huge wins back then, and those were significant wins back then. Those were kind of, you know, what everyone was thinking about building towards spending money on. You fast forward to the present day and age, and a lot of that, has been done now. And so, being able to source and stage data now, like oftentimes from like a CFO finance perspective, that's kind of table stakes, right? Like everyone should be expected to do that, right? So
Right.
just
It's
having
it's the
access to your
minimum
data
bar. Just hey, well
is
done.
it's
You yeah. You're
it,
basically done what is the minimum viable product. Like it's nothing. It's yeah.
exactly right. Exactly right. That's just to get into the game, right? That's normal. And the problem that CFOs face now is not that, hey, I have my whole team necessarily spending all day, aggregating, cleaning data, et cetera, because data teams have helped us solve that over the past 20, 30 years. Like I said, with data warehousing, with data mart solutions, with, all these sorts of things that have now come to market. So the problem is less that. The problem now that we're all starting to open our eyes to is, well, how do we really, now we have all this data here for the most part. And I'm generalizing a little bit because every company is at a different stage of evolution, right? Like some still certainly do struggle with sourcing and aggregation, and that's going to always be somewhat of a problem. But really, what most CFOs are opening their eyes to now is, we have all this data at our fingertips. How do we really use it to generate real insight now, right? And a lot of our teams over the past 20, 30 years have spent so much time in becoming like great data aggregators, right? And great data consolidators, great data cleansers. But now I want them to actually spend more time using it to drive insight. And I would say, I'd wager, and I've talked to a number of CFOs in my career. I'd wager that every single CFO that you go talk to today, one of their top, five, if not even top three problems is saying, how do we use our data better, faster, and to drive better decision making, right? And you think about that, that's coming from like what was considered like a non-technical, a little bit of a non-technical function to say that that's probably top five, top three concerns of theirs right now. I think is big. In today's day and age, data tools are and data platforms are relatively user friendly, relatively cheap. You've got everything from tools like Snowflake for aggregating data and cleansing data. You've got a myriad of ERPs and other kind of places that are easy to access your finance data. You've got CPM tools. You've got even more user level tools like Power BI and Tableau and stuff that really have now made this work that 20, 30 years ago was a full-time job, right? Like just sourcing, aggregating, and getting access to is not that big of a deal anymore. And so all of these kind of tools, in play have made that a reality, and all the work that the data industry and kind of tech and, building these tools over the past 20 years have made that a reality. Now you look at the problems in the current day and age, using that data, integrating that data is a huge problem now, right? So you have all these different tools, and how do you integrate them, right? Data pipelines to make sure all these tools are speaking the same language, and you have single sources of truth, stuff like that. Um, you look at, you have this rise of this type of role set, which is like a finance systems manager, director, VP level role, right? Which, honestly, 5, 6 years ago, 10 years ago didn't exist, right? And I think that just, shows how much of a focus is, from the finance perspective on data tools, platforms, and how big of a deal that is nowadays. But to the point about the present day and age, the real problem is not just those simple reports, right? That's par for the course. It's how do we use the data at hand to generate, more next level type stuff, analytics, trend pattern recognition, predictive analytics, scenario modeling, but not scenario modeling in 10, 15 years ago, which was more at a higher level, like more detailed data driven scenario modeling, right? At the customer level, at the product SKU level, stuff like that. That's where CFOs struggle nowadays when it comes to data. So it's a paradigm how it used to be and how it is today. And really, when you look at the resources that really thrive and the assets that really thrive in today's day and age, it's storytelling, right? So how can you take this data? How can you actually tell the story, right, of what's actually happening? Because that's what the CFO is concerned about, right? It's not just about putting those numbers on the page. It's what do the numbers mean? And you look at it, think about it from the CFO perspective. CFO has to go and get in front of the other folks on the executive team, the other folks on the board, and say, not, here's $100 on this spreadsheet. It's not just about the $100. What does it mean? Why is it 100? Why is it not 200? Why is it not 50? Right? And those are the sorts of gaps that CFOs are dealing with in the data space today.
Right. So you're basically having to put the T-ball set up for them to go crush it out of the park for the board of directors and the other members of executive leadership. And so what you're saying is it's no longer the reports. It's higher level analytics and then being able to provide a story for them to communicate to their stakeholders, right? Which is going to be board of directors, the CEO, if it's a private company, potentially certain owners or things of that nature. And so when they're stepping in, they're looking for you to put the T-ball set up and so they can just crush out of the park. And so you feel like, if I'm understanding you correctly, a lot of the data teams fail because they don't understand how to bridge that gap to build that T-ball setup to just kind of, okay, they think like, why am I being plagued with 10,000 requests on how does this work? How does this work? Oh, let's change this. Um, oh, we want to change our IRR metric or our ARR or whatever it is. And so then they're like, what if we do this? What if we do that? What if we do this? And the data team's like, we're stifled. So
Yeah.
what do you recommend to like your SVPs? Because obviously VPs or directors in the data space who, having been a consultant at Deloitte and some of these other like large name consulting firms and been doing it for over a decade, you're the voice of reason, right? You come in and you'll end up saying the exact same thing, and the CFOs are like, "This is awesome. You're the guy. Like, you fixed our problem." And then, here on the data teams, we're just like, dude, we really, like, seriously, we've been saying this for years, like the exact same
Yep.
thing." And you're like, so how do you help our audience bridge that gap from being in a place where where they've beat their head against the wall trying to say the same thing? Like, what is it and you've been able to experience seeing it and being the guy who says it just that different way to where they're hearing it?
Yeah, I think, and this comment I think goes both ways, both from, and it's probably applicable to not just finance, but really kind of any more functional area within a business. But understanding the other side of the fence more, right? Speaking that language a little more. I've seen so many folks in the CFO space that are super successful because they can speak the tech side, right? And they understand that a little bit. But in the other way as well, right? The most successful data projects from a finance data perspective I've ever been involved in have been where the data engineering folks or data analytics folks or whatever that are on the project are taking the time to not just engineer it from a functional perspective, but learn what the use case is and learn what like I said, what that pipe analogy I used earlier, learn what's actually flowing through those pipes. What does it mean, right?
Right.
Um, there's nothing worse from, and like I said, probably applies to any function that throughout a business. But speaking purely from my perspective and experience on the finance side, nothing worse than investing a lot of time, energy, money, into a large scale data project, only to then get your analysts in there, and the data isn't even usable, right? Or the
Right.
reports or whatever's coming isn't usable because of something like you kind of hit on a little bit earlier, understanding things like IRR or whatever, right? These sorts of metrics, but because maybe the folks that are building didn't understand what the data actually was, right? And they can say, hey, yeah, this I can integrate these two pieces together, and I can flow data from this table to that table or this application, that application. I can source it, I can ETL all this stuff, and it's great. But I didn't understand what I was actually pushing through this pipeline, and now I've spent however much time building something. Like I said, nothing worse than getting your analysts in there and like, well, this data doesn't really work anyway, so either I can't use it or I need to manually adjust it on top of that anyways, right?
Right.
And so I think getting data teams to really understand the source data they're working with, not just from a technical functional perspective, right? But what does it actually mean? And and I know it's a bit ambiguous and it's also hard, and it's why a lot of people don't do it, right? Because it's
Right.
easier just to go to the requirement sheet, go to the spec sheet, and just go build something, right? It's harder to say, no, I need you to go and actually learn what this is, right? And learn what it means. Why is this important to the business? Why is this important to the office of the CFO? And going back to what I was starting with, the most successful data projects I've been a part of are where those engineers were almost functioning as part of our team for the length of the project, right? Coming and sitting side by side with the analysts that were going to be using, the product at the end of the day or the solution at the end of the day, and saying, what does this mean? Does this meet the needs? I want to understand, not just to check a box, but understand myself because I want to know and take ownership of it from that more SME knowledge perspective. That's where I think the gap is, right? Because oftentimes you have, and it goes both ways, right? Both from the functional standpoint, understanding the technical standpoint, and the technical standpoint, understanding the functional standpoint. But I think that is a huge gap on both sides, is having that slight hybridization of skill sets and knowledge, and really having full ownership of it from that perspective too. And hey, I'm building this data pipeline or this data platform or whatnot, or this data product that a CFO team is going to use. But because I understand some of these intricacies or understand what they're trying to do, and I have actual kind of a level of SME knowledge ownership of the actual detail data that's flowing through this pipeline, I can make changes as I'm seeing them, and I can prevent things from going too far that's going to be reworked, or something that's not going to be useful. And I think that's where I see a lot of the gaps.
Yeah. So if I'm hearing you correctly, it's almost kind of like I got my degree in accounting, and one of the first things I did was doing full automation of financial statements and things of that nature from a data and BI perspective. And I remember in all of the higher level accounting classes, it was like my grandfather's the one who directed me to go into accounting, and the reason is because when I was entering into college, he was an entrepreneur, and so I asked him, as an entrepreneur, what would you recommend I go into for college? What would you think is probably the most valuable skill set or asset to get into? And he said, absolutely, without a question, accounting, because it's the language of business. And then,
Sure.
as again, I was going through the accounting program, it's the language of business. And I think kind of what you're hitting on is like, learn the language of the business, learn the finance terms, learn what they actually are. So when you're building them, you're able to not only look at it and go, well, this is not going to work because these next logical conclusions are the next asks. And so
Yep.
if you end up seeing that as you're building things out and you're looking at some of the expense metrics or some of the revenue metrics, and you're like, okay, as we're going through these, this isn't going to line up with cost of goods sold or whatever it may be, and you're going to be able to determine, oh, okay, like when I'm building this, I need to consider this aspect of the finance world. So you're not just designing to the tech requirement, right? And the tech spec that the finance guy is given. And so to be successful, you're saying learn finance. It's not like, oh, go ahead and learn the new library for PyTorch. As valuable as that
Yep.
might be, or whatever Python language or the next new tool, like, oh, I'm going to go get a certification in Databricks. And I think Bill Inman actually posted an article about this, talking about the fact that data and technology roles have been incentivized because they're only staying in a place a year or two, and they get the next software application under their belt, and then their value is substantively increased. And so then their value driver for their take home pay is learning new technology. But I think what you're saying is if you take the time to slow down and say, I'm going to make the strategic long play and learn the business, learn finance, as opposed to um, familiarizing myself with the latest and greatest technology, that would be the longer term play that enables you to have that proper collaborative conversation with the CFO and deliver that value. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, I think you summarized it pretty well. I think, and because there's a lot of times too where if you understand right the outcome or the use case from a functional business perspective, then you really can maybe from that tech perspective you see things that can be done better as well. You can process re-engineer it a little bit, and you're not just taking exactly how it's done today, maybe automating it or streamlining it or whatever, but that sort of like real transformative value add engineering doesn't happen if you don't really understand the end use case, don't really understand right what the user is needing it for, what's that CFO needing it for, what sort of questions are they trying to get answered.
So, to that end, what would you recommend? So, somebody's like, okay, Chris, I hear you. I think not doing a bunch of research on the newest MDM tool or the latest AI agent. I'm going to invest in doubling down on learning finance. What would you
Yeah,
recommend?
and
Like, where would be a good starting platform? Like, is there either a book you'd recommend, or would you just say, hey, just see if the CFOs, like, what would you recommend? Hey, you want to start becoming that guy who's going to be able to learn it, and maybe that's just asking the CFO, would you
yeah,
be willing to give me 30 minutes every 2 weeks or something? Like, where would you direct our audience to say, okay, I think you're right, the long-term play for me to really next level my career is how to communicate properly with the CFO, and I want to learn finance. Where do you direct them?
yeah. I think more the latter of what you were talking about there, and I think there's a couple different levels you could think about from the more leader executive level is probably interfacing with those CFO level or other VP SVP level leadership roles on the finance side, and saying as simple as, hey, let me understand what your main problems are, right, and let's talk about this every so often, right. It's the soft skills part of kind of learning and walking the mile in someone else's shoes that I think is oftentimes missing, right, in these sorts of functional relationships between tech and finance. Um, I think the second piece of that is from the more analyst engineer level. And I know this has been talked about a few times on your show and podcast already, but really like embedding resources within those teams for those projects, right. And like I said, the most successful finance data projects that I've been a part of have been when the data engineers have been embedded in the finance team and sitting side by side, maybe not physically because of the working world we live in today, but virtually, day by day, talking to those folks, seeing where their problem is, seeing how data and how data engineering and how data analytics, et cetera, can solve some of those problems, and understanding it from that user perspective, and not just taking a spec sheet, not just taking a requirement sheet, and going back into some backroom and coding some amazing solution up, but day by day, sitting with and working shoulder to shoulder with those finance folks, and learning where the problems are, learning why it's a big deal to not just to them, but to the business as a whole too, right? And I think that is key. And I think doing that, um, you know, data folks and tech folks learn so much more than reading a book or looking at resources, which are also great resources as well too. But I would say, yeah, get out there and go shoulder to shoulder with your finance compatriots and coworkers, and see how they're working, see what they're doing, see where the pain points are on a day-to-day basis, on a week basis, project to project basis, see what's keeping them up at night, understand that, and then see how you can apply data, tech, analytics solutions to that, right? And go from that direction first, as opposed to going the other direction. I think that is what I would recommend really any data and tech team do more of from the CFO perspective.
Right. Yeah. So it's going to be just getting in with your finance colleagues and basically
Yep.
peering into it, and then uh, and I think if I heard you correctly, you're saying basically roll up your sleeves and perform what they're doing.
Yeah. Yep.
So it's
Exactly.
not
I
just
mean,
like, hey, come and teach me. Come and teach me this specific
yep.
thing that you're building and why you're building it. How
Exactly.
it's a
Walk
value to
that
the.
mile in their shoes. Exactly.
Got it. So then, would you recommend to data leaders to actually carving out and enabling their team to say, like, okay, we have all of our, like, their existing workload doesn't end tomorrow, um, but
For sure.
basically enabling their team underneath them to turn around and say, hey, spend an hour on Fridays with Ricky, your CFO, or your one of your finance advisory members, and go through and walk through his 10 reports that he
For
uses on a
sure.
routine basis.
For sure, and looking at maybe functionally what those specific data and tech folks are working on, and from a project basis, going and saying, hey, who are the finance owners, if it is a finance project, right, of this process, this tool, this system, this report, whatever, and going and spending that time with them and understanding it and seeing how they do it, observing how they do it, doing it yourself a little bit. These sorts of things all go a huge way, and I think a big point too is, and I'm a very tech oriented person myself, despite being a CPA, and I know that commonly in the tech area and really any functional area where you get in like any sort of specialization, you can we can tend to gatekeep a little bit, or it's like, oh well, this person doesn't understand how this works, so I'm gonna kind of like keep access to this tool to myself, or keep kind of the knowledge of how this works, or not open this up to others because they're gonna mess it up or whatever, right? And I kind of, or maybe even there's a little bit of defensiveness, right? Like, well, this is my job, so I don't want to open up
Right.
access to whatever tech solution to someone else. I think taking those gates down and like really eliminating the gatekeeping as much as possible, and that is a top down thing from leadership, right? And saying, I don't want there to be any gatekeeping. If you have a finance person that is interested in learning how to go and query code themselves off of a database via SQL or Python or whatever, I think we should enable that more than restrict it, right? If there's a finance person that says, hey, no, I want to get into this SQL server myself to do whatever job in here, I think this is going to be interesting to do. I think less gatekeeping is better, and it promotes this sort of cross learning and cross pollination, even more so. So I think,
Yeah.
yes,
So I,
absolutely. Go ahead.
having been on like the BI and data side, I've never found enabling the finance team to write their own queries has bolstered my understanding of the finance. But I do agree that it does bridge a better gap and a better
Exactly.
relationship with obviously the understanding of doing your proper risk mitigation, making sure that PII and things of that nature are protected, um,
Absolutely right. Yeah.
and making sure that it's very well clearly known to higher levels of management within the finance team that if your guy presents a bunch of information and it's not routed through certain processes, if they make decisions on it, they're fully accountable.
Yeah,
Because
exactly.
I've seen that as well. Like you got the rogue, and this is where the data teams get all cringed out, right? Is they give them access, and then they get skewered for giving them access when they made a bad decision because they wrote a query wrong or didn't do something that, or what ends up happening is they'll build something and then they'll say, "Oh, it doesn't match your numbers. Mine is right," and it's like, so great. Now I get to go ahead and do data validation for you for the next two
Yep,
weeks because I gave you access to write a query and you had no idea what you were doing, right? And
absolutely. And I think
so
that those are real risks for sure too that need to
so
be.
it's one of those things where you have to, as a senior leader on the data team, is doing proper training. These are the reasons why we set these things up. This is how our cadence is to ensure that you're not getting some of that rogue finance team member who thinks they're going to be able to bridge that gap and not understand some of the inner workings of the ERP system or specifically how they're leveraged. Because at their last job, they used SAP, and clearly this company uses it the exact same way. And so,
Which is never true, right? So,
what?
which is never true, right? So,
Yeah, exactly, right. And but I mean, those are the things that the data teams definitely run into. Is you get the seasoned finance guy who says, "I ran queries in the last place, and so clearly this company, I can run the exact same queries and they'll work wonderfully." But yeah,
exactly.
I do agree.
You got to mitigate those risks for sure.
Yeah, I do agree that bridging that gap does make a huge enablement, and if you're able to allow organic SMEs to do analytics within their own departments and filter them back to the data teams that can then reinforce the data infrastructure for them to do those analytics and those reporting, you can get this really nice kind of feedback loop that actually you got to create the proper cadence. But I have I could go on this for hours, so I got capstone myself. But there's a proper methodology to ensure that you get that proper feedback loop. So I would do want to just kind of close with like a final question. Just
Sure.
if you were to give one piece of advice to an executive data person, that's kind of like a 1-2 sentence, like kind of cliche, even if it's not cliche, whatever. But one piece of advice that you would give them to walk away with to really change their career, what would that be?
And specifically in the context of working with the
Working with
CFO
finance,
group,
yeah,
working with finance. Got it. I mean, I think, honestly, not to beat a dead horse, but going back to what we've been talking about this whole, 30 plus minutes here, but, understand your CFO, right?
right,
Understand what their concerns are. Understand what they're doing with the data that you are producing. Um, because that CFO, like I said, needs to vouch for those numbers, needs to go up to bat for the whole company in front of the board, in front of outside investors, in front of lenders, whatever,
yep,
and needs to answer questions based off of that information, right? And so the more that you can understand that, the more that you can understand, and that's very very broad. I get that, but there's all the trickle down from there, understanding that and understanding what those concerns, understanding what it's being used for, and understand and walk that mile in their shoes a little bit.
right,
I think if we can do more of that in the finance and tech partnership and finance and data partnership, it's going to unlock so much synergy. So that would
right.
be like boil it down to that kind of concise statement.
Yeah, and I love that. I think that's assume his role, and now how do you leverage your data team, right?
Yep, exactly, exactly.
Uh, Great. So, Chris, thank you so much for joining. We're just so excited to have you, and I know that this is such a valuable perspective to set up with how do I interface with my CEO, CFO, and making sure,
Yep,
especially since they're going to be the people who have the highest level of criticality of the accuracy of the data, right?
for sure,
So,
for sure.
thank you,
Well,
Chris.
thanks for having me. Yeah, this was a great conversation. Really enjoyed it.
Yeah, thank you.